My friend Gary, commercial fisherman. He would sail his little fishing boat all the way up and fish for halibut off of the coast of Haida Gwaii. And one day, Gary called me and said that he needed to relocate his boat, which was at that time parked at a wharf just down off of Fraser Street in Vancouver, and he needed to relocate it over to Steveston Harbor, which is on the other side of Richmond. So he asked if I'd like to come along for the ride. So I thought, well, this would be an interesting experience. So one morning, Aileen dropped me off at the dock where his boat was moored, and we headed up the Fraser River, one of the arms there, to New Westminster, and then came down the main arm of the Fraser underneath the Alex Fraser Bridge and over the Massey Tunnel to Steveston. And when I got to the wharf off of Fraser Street, I was surprised at Gary's boat. I got a picture of a boat here, and this is not the boat. The boat that Gary had was kind of similar, but it was about half that size. It was just this little wooden fishing boat, and I was like amazed that he would take this out in the open ocean and fish for halibut for days on end. And so it was just a really cool trip. It had some cool navigational equipment. It had obviously the depth finder, which is really cool. When we went over the Massey Tunnel, all of a sudden you saw this square thing on the bottom of the riverbed, right? So you could tell how deep it was. It had GPS, so you knew where you were, and we've talked about GPS the last few weeks. But then it had this thing called the Autopilot. And the Autopilot was a device that you could set to keep the vessel on course, even if there was a current, even if there was a wind. So I had no idea how it really worked, but it was easy to set. And so while we were chugging up the river, we were having a great conversation, and we were kind of sitting there in the wheelhouse. But he had the Autopilot set, so it would just kind of keep the boat in the middle of the channel. And when we got to the bend in the river, he would just spin the knob on the Autopilot, and the Autopilot would automatically correct 10 degrees left or right. So, you'd spin it and it would come around automatically, and it would head off on this new course. And if it wasn't enough, you'd spin it again or you'd spin it back, depending on the channel at that point. And it was just a really interesting thing to experience, this little boat navigating itself on autopilot. Now, of course, autopilot on fishing boats is one thing, but they also use autopilots on commercial aircraft. And they've been using it for years to control the trajectory of an aircraft without the constant attention from the pilot, right? Because over the course of a long flight, to keep it on course, to keep it the right speed, even to keep it level, it's a tiring process. So they've got these autopilots that help them with that. And this is actually the control system, the autopilot from a Boeing 747-200. And you'd think a plane that big, it would be a little more complicated than that. But that's what it is. And so they assist the pilot in flying the plane, right? That's what autopilot is. In fact, the new autopilots will even land the plane. If the weather's poor, if the weather's foggy, they don't have visuals, they're able to land the plane pretty much on autopilot, which, of course, if you're a nervous flyer, that is a little disconcerting, isn't it? Yeah, remember the old days when the pilot used to come back and kind of, talk with the passengers, especially the first class passengers during the flight, and you're sitting there and you're watching the pilot walk down the aisle and you're going like, who's flying the plane, right? Well, of course, they probably got another pilot up there, but basically George is flying the plane. And George is the nickname that they gave to the autopilot because it was invented by a guy named George back in the 1930s. In fact, the first autopilot was actually invented for aircraft in 1912. So this has been around for a long time, right? Of course, the big thing now is autopilots for vehicles. Have you heard about that? I mean, the Tesla's got them, and some of the new vehicles have got this. They're even talking about putting autopilot in semi-trucks. I mean, can you imagine? Having these huge transport trucks flying down the highway on autopilot. Of course, they say it's safer than humans, right? Well, the jury is still out on that because you say, Darcy, I'm not so much worried about me on autopilot. I'm worried about the other guy on autopilot. I mean, is that autopilot really working? What we want is somebody paying attention, right? We want somebody with their hands on the wheel, looking out for obstacles and alert for obstructions and just paying attention when they drive. But let's be honest. How many of us already kind of drive on autopilot? Right? Really? I mean, coming out of our neighborhood, we come down the road and we come out to the Island Highway, and typically I turn left to go to work, to come into the office here. And if we're going like to the mall or going to Costco, going shopping like that, we turn right. And so often I'm usually by myself, turn left, no problem, come to the office. But when we are going somewhere else and Aileen is with me, when we're coming up to the intersection at the highway, she says, remember, we're going to Costco. Because she knows that if she does not say that, we are not going to turn right. We are automatically going to turn left. Because I'm on autopilot. That's just kind of the way it goes. And sometimes she looks at me and she just says, how do you get anywhere? Just because I'm thinking about some other stuff. So, autopilot though for, whether it's fishing boats or commercial aircraft is probably a good thing. Maybe even eventually for vehicles, probably a good thing. But when it comes to living your everyday life, living on autopilots probably isn't a good thing. Because our personal autopilots aren't that good. Living on autopilot means that you're not really paying attention to the direction of your life. You're just kind of cruising along automatically. You're just kind of cruising along mindlessly. And here's the concern. If you're journeying through life just on autopilot, kind of thoughtlessly, kind of carelessly, you just may end up somewhere where you don't want to be. You just might end up somewhere unintentionally, unexpectedly, where you don't want to be. And I've seen it happen, and I think you probably have too. Only instead of ending up at the office, instead of ending up at Costco, your destination can have much more serious consequences. And I've sat with people in my office or in their living room, and they say, Pastor, how did I get here? How did I get here? And often by the time they talk to me, they're in crisis. It's a marriage crisis or a financial crisis or maybe a relationship crisis with an adult child or maybe it's a mental health crisis. And as much as I love people and as much as I want to help people, the hard reality is that by the time they talk to me, there usually isn't an easy fix. I mean, I'm just not that good. I'm not that smart. In fact, sometimes I look at people and say, you need to go see a real pastor. Because, I mean, the crisis you're in, I don't know what to do. No, that's not. Here's the problem. The problem is that usually the crisis that people are in is not just something that happened out of the blue. It's the consequence of living on autopilot. Crisis is often the consequence of living on autopilot. It's the consequence of living your life in a certain direction. It's the consequence of not really paying attention to where you're going. So we're in a series right now that we call Treasure Hunt, and you gotta admit that the stage is decked out good for Treasure Hunt, right? Excited about Summer Adventure Camp. We might need to get them to leave this set up for a few weeks. I'm kind of enjoying preaching with an alligator on the table here this morning. So, but we're in this series called Treasure Hunt. We've been looking through the book of Proverbs for wisdom, and today we're going to do a dive into Proverbs 7 that tells the story of somebody living on autopilot and the dangers of living on autopilot. Now, when we think of the book of Proverbs, we usually don't think about stories, right? We usually think about Proverbs as, these short, memorable sayings, and from chapter 10 on, that's essentially what the book of Proverbs is. In fact, there's 375 of those short little sayings. But there are a few stories in Proverbs, and this is probably the main one. In chapter 7, King Solomon, who wrote much of the book of Proverbs, tells a story. And we don't know whether this story was a real event that he actually experienced or just a story he made up to make his point. But wow, wait till we get to the points. This story comes to a point. And so Solomon tells this crazy story, and it's about a young guy that's living on autopilot. And it's a story that could have happened 3,000 years ago, or it's a story that could have happened yesterday. So let's dive in. Proverbs 7, verse 6 and 7. It says, "While I was at the window of my house, looking through the curtain, I saw some naive young men, and one in particular who lacked common sense." So Solomon is kind of setting the scene for us. He says, one evening, I'm looking over the city and kind of looking out, probably, a hot evening like we had, so the windows are open. I'm standing by the window to get some air, and I noticed this posse of young guys, and there's one guy there in particular, and we don't know how old he is, but from what we learned later, he's at least north of puberty. Maybe he's a teenager, probably a young adult, but whatever his age, Solomon says that he's hanging around with some naive young men. And that's actually an important description of who these guys are. When you read through the book of Proverbs, Proverbs talks about three types of people. There's basically three types of people. There's the wise, of course, that he talks about. The wise is somebody who, go to slide 8, please. There we go. The wise is someone who loves God and are committed to his ways. So that's who the wise is. So that's one type of person in Proverbs. But then there's also the fool. And the fool is somebody who doesn't love God and is not committed to his ways. There should be a slide for the fool too. There we go. Doesn't love God, not following God's ways. They're going their own way. And then the third one is what Proverbs calls the naive or the simple. Those who really haven't figured out which way they're going. So you've got these three people. On one side you got the wise, on the other side you got the fool, and then in the middle you got the naive. They haven't put the work in to become wise, but they haven't quite made that decision to just kind of do their own thing, go their own way, and ignore God and become the fool that Proverb talks about. So Solomon would classify these guys and this one particular guy in particular as naive. Basically, he's saying he's on autopilot. He's not paying attention to his life. He's not paying attention to his direction, and he doesn't understand the consequences of his actions. That's exactly why Solomon's telling this story. So he sees this naive guy not paying attention, heading the wrong direction. And we'll pick it up at verse 8. It says he was crossing the street near the house of an immoral woman, strolling down the path by her house. And it was at twilight in the evening as deep darkness fell. And, well, you probably don't need to be a Hebrew scholar to know where this story is headed, do you? Here we got a young guy cruising the streets, wrong time of day, wrong part of town, wandering just kind of casually towards her house. Before we go any further, I think I just need to stop and explain something here. Proverbs is written by a father giving advice to his son. So basically, much of Proverbs is what we would call the dad talk, okay? It's the dad talk. That's why the examples and the warnings are tilted the way that they are. You read through Proverbs, and there's a lot of talk about, my son, watch out for the immoral woman, right? I mean, there's a lot of that kind of talk in Proverbs about the immoral woman. But you need to understand the overall picture of Proverbs. In fact, I would encourage you, if you do the YouVersion thing, go to YouVersion. There's a reading plan there called The Wisdom of Proverbs. It's by the Bible Project, and it just does a great job of kind of unpacking some of the bigger picture of Proverbs, and really helpful. It's about a 31-day program or 32-day program. So we're going to be in Proverbs for a few more weeks. That would be a great thing for you to check out, because they explain some of this. Because the other thing that we need to understand about Proverbs is that, especially in the first 9 chapters, there's kind of 4 characters. If Proverbs was going to be a drama, there's 4 characters. There's the father who's, giving the dad talk. He does most of the talking. And then there's the son, who is the one that should be doing the listening. And then, Father, Son, and not the Holy Spirit, Father, Son, and the immoral woman. But then there's this 4th character who is really the star of the show. And this 4th character in the book of Proverbs is Lady Wisdom. And she personifies the concept of wisdom in the book of Proverbs. So you find passages like Proverbs chapter 3, where it says, joyful is the person who finds wisdom, the one who gains understanding. For wisdom is more profitable than silver, and her wages are better than gold. Wisdom is more precious than rubies. Nothing you desire can compare with her. So wisdom is personified as a woman. And you get into Proverbs chapter 8 and 9, there are a couple of powerful poems from Lady Wisdom. And she really is the star of the book of Proverbs. So don't understand what's going on here, or misunderstand what's going on here, okay? Proverbs is not saying that women are dangerous and immoral, okay? Proverbs is just saying that some women are dangerous and immoral, just like some guys are dangerous and immoral. And so, because this is a dad talk to his son, it kind of tilts the direction of the immoral woman. But the story that we're reading in Proverbs 7 could just as much be about a dumb girl and a immoral man as it is about a dumb guy and an immoral woman. Okay? Does that make sense? So it's not picking on the women here. Basically, this is a story about a dude who's on autopilot, who's not thinking. He's just out for a stroll, strolling down the path by her house. Wrong time of day, wrong part of town, and he's walking along, and he's probably thinking he's the man. The soundtrack in his head is, I'm too sexy for my shirt, too sexy for my sandals, I'm too sexy for my socks. Like this guy, he's thinking he's it. He's it. And meanwhile, Solomon is watching from the window, and the soundtrack Solomon's hearing in his head is the soundtrack from Jaws. Dun-dun, dun-dun. Dun-dun. Because he knows where this is going. He knows that this guy's actually shark bait. The kid thinks he's out for an evening stroll. He's on autopilot. Oh, man, maybe he's a little curious about what's happening, but you know what? He's a big boy. He can walk in that part of town. He can go out late. He can wander into a neighborhood he really shouldn't be in at a time when he should probably be at home drinking hot chocolate and watching Sports Center. But he's out cruising. And the father telling the story knew that seemingly despite the harmless and casual scenario, this was actually a very dangerous situation with consequences that could wreck a life. And friends, here's what we need to understand, whether we realize it or not, whether we want it or not, whether we intend it or not. Every choice you make sets the direction for your life. The choices you make set the direction for your life. Amen. It's a step down a path. It's a step down a road. It's a direction that leads to a destination. And you may not be intending to go there, But it's a direction that's going to take you there, whether you want it to take you there or not. You may mean to head an entirely different direction. You may not even be really paying attention to the direction that you're heading. Your intentions may be well and good, but it's not where you want to go or assume you're going. It's about the direction your steps are actually taking you, right? So Andy Stanley puts it like this, and I heard this years ago, and it just kind of resonated with me. Andy says this: direction, not intention, determines our destination. Okay? Direction, not intention, determines our destination. And friends, this has kind of stuck with me, and so I'd love for it to stick with you too. So can we say this together? Let's say it together. Direction, not intention, determines our destination. Let's say it one more time. Direction, not intention, determines our destination. It's your direction that determines your destination, not your intention. You may intend to go a certain way all you want, but if you're not driving that direction, it's not going to happen. I mean, if you pull out to the Parkway in Nanaimo and you're wanting to go to Victoria, and if you turn the wrong way, even in spite of wanting to go to Victoria, you're going to end up in Port Hardy. I don't care what you want. If you drive the wrong direction, you're not going to get to your intended destination. So it's not your intention, it's the direction you're actually heading. Direction, not intention, determines our destination. So friends, we've got to ask ourselves, what direction are we really heading? And it's based on our actual choices, not just our intentions. So this young guy in our story was headed in a direction. Maybe he wasn't even really aware of what he was doing or where he was going. He was on autopilot, just out for an evening stroll. And our story continues. Verse 10, it says, the woman approached him, seductively dressed and sly of heart. She was the brash, rebellious type, never content to stay at home. And now, ironically, if you know the story of Solomon, you know that Solomon made some poor choices in his own life when it came to women. Primarily that there were too many of them. So Solomon made his own choice, and maybe that's why he knew what was going down here. Maybe he knew from experience that this kind of lady was bad news. In fact, it says she threw her arms around him and kissed him, and with a brazen look, she said, I've just made my peace offerings and fulfilled my vows. And that doesn't mean that she's spiritual. That doesn't mean that she, intends to go worship at the temple. That just means, she's ready to have some fun. And then she says this, and really I think this is one of the funniest verses in the Bible. Verse 15, she says, you're the one I was. All right, we're back. That's another point we can edit out. Right in the funniest verse in the Bible. Can you imagine that? You're the one I was looking for. Really? Really? I mean, of all the guys in town, she came out looking for him? I mean, he's really Mr. Stud Muffin? Like really? And you just got to think, buddy, if you believe what she's laying down here, you're even dumber than you act. You are really leaning into the fool that Proverbs talks about here, right? But of course, this guy in the story, he's not thinking with his brain. He's just thinking, baby, This is my lucky day or my lucky night. And for a young guy who's just kind of out for an evening stroll, could it get any better than this? And so it goes on. Verse 21 says she seduced him with her pretty speech and enticed him with her flattery. She goes on, she says, we're not going to get caught. No one has to know about this. We're consenting adults. My husband's away on a business trip. He's probably doing the same thing. Come on, we'll have the night of our lives. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. She says, after this night is over, I'll go back to my life and you go back to your life, and nothing will have changed and nothing will have happened. It's no big deal. It's just one night. It's just an event. But look at how the story ends. It's a little graphic. It says he followed her at once, like an ox going to the slaughter. He was like a stag caught in a trap, awaiting the arrow that would pierce its heart. He was like a bird flying into a snare, little knowing it would cost him his life. Wow. You see, that's what happens when you're on autopilot. And you may say, well, Darcy, that's a little extreme. Isn't it? I mean, that's a little graphic. He's making a wrong choice. We get that. He's going to get in trouble. We get that. But an ox going to the slaughter? Like who is this woman? A sexy serial killer? Like what's going on here? Is he really going to die? Well, I don't know, but we could play the what if game. What if her husband comes home unexpectedly and finds out? What if he catches some kind of STD? What if this one night stand becomes a habit that becomes what he lives for and becomes his character and then ruins his chance for an honest relationship? I mean, what kind of good, honest woman wants this kind of a guy with this kind of reputation? Right? But it's not just about the physical or the emotional or the relational consequences. What about the spiritual consequences? Do we understand that the seriousness and the consequences of sin? Proverbs 16:25 says, there's a path before each person that seems right, but it ends in death. So there are consequences. We are actually held accountable. There is a destination that we end up. The Apostle Paul put the same thought very much the same way in Romans 6:23, where he says the wages of sin is death. Serious stuff. Yet I think if we're honest, if I'm honest, we have to admit that it's easy to play with sin. It's easy to toy with it. And not just sexual sin, but often it is sexual sin, especially, we live in a culture that kind of winks at sexual sin, and we all become, I think, a little bit numb to it because of the pervasive sexuality of our culture and our media and all that. But friends, this is what happens when we're living on autopilots. You end up going places you don't intend to go. You end up doing things that you don't intend to do. And stuff just happens that has consequences. Remember the Queen of the North? And that's not something from The Wizard of Oz. What was that one? That was the Queen of the West. Anyway, the Queen of the North. It was B.C. Ferry, right? And this happened, I think, the March of 2006. I know it was kind of right before we moved to the island, because I remember this story and thinking, wow, a BC ferries that we all ride regularly, right? One of them actually sank. Like, crazy stuff, right? And I know some of you probably know much more about this story than I do, but it was a crazy story. And part of the story was that the Queen of the North was on autopilot. And coming out of the channel, it should have made just a slight course correction. But no course correction was made, and it kept sailing straight. And in 14 minutes, it was about 1 kilometer off course, just 1,000 meters off course. That's all it was, and it ran aground on Gill Island. And on that dark and stormy night, the ferry sank, and 2 people lost their lives. And the investigation that followed, they figured that it was human error that was the primary cause of the sinking. See, autopilot can be a good thing, but you've got to pay attention. You've got to make the course correction. And friends, how many times has we as pastors, or even you as friends, had a phone call or sat with someone and they say, how did this happen? How did I get here? I mean, I'm a good person. I didn't mean for this to happen. I had dreams and plans and intentions for another destination. There was, whether it was a relationship thing or financial plans or spiritual plans or health aspirations. Well, it started with a step down a path. It started with a step down, or often unintended, certainly not premeditated. It's just that things kind of got on autopilot and you weren't really paying attention. You wanted to meet that and marry that great Christian guy or Christian girl who loved Jesus, got their act together, but you started dating somebody because they were cute or because you were lonely. One thing led to another. Or you really wanted to have a solid financial future for your family. You wanted to be able to live generously towards the Lord and towards others, but somehow you've maxed out your credit cards and your line of credit and you're just barely getting by. Or maybe you wanted to have that great marriage, that great family, but you got focused on work, or you got focused on whatever, and you never really put the time or the energy in, and now your marriage has kind of drifted apart. Or maybe you expected to be, healthy and active in your senior years. You wanted to play with the grandkids and travel, but the reality is that you neglected your health, you neglected your body, and now you're in a destination. Or maybe you really wanted to follow the Lord. You had an experience, maybe it was at summer camp or summer adventure camp, or some Sunday you came to a church like Generations Church or whatever it was, and there was something inside of you that said, yes, I want to follow Jesus with all my heart. I want to be committed to Him. And you started down that path, but over the years something happened, and maybe you started to drift from church. You started to drift from being involved with the faith community, and you got busy with other things, and you didn't realize that a step away from church actually became a step away from God. And you're on autopilot. And now you find yourself up on the rocks of an island you shouldn't be. And friends, that list could go on. You can probably add a dozen things to it. The intentions are good, the intentions are great, but it's not the intention that counts. It's the direction that you and I are actually going. And so, friends, I got to ask this morning. What is your direction? Do you need to make a course correction? Are you on autopilot? I'm not talking about your intentions. I'm not talking about your desires. This morning we're talking about actually your direction and your actions, because intentions really don't count much. Direction is everything. It's your direction that determines your destination. And when you look at your life, if you are seeing some subtle or not so subtle discrepancies between your intentions and your actions, then friends, you need to stop and pay attention. Maybe it's time that you intentionally go and you flick off the autopilots. Because those discrepancies that are there are just not meaningless, isolated events. They're actually a step down a path that leads somewhere. There's a destination. Life is connected. And the good news is this morning is that you can change course. You can change course today, right now. Let's pray. And God, we would pray this morning that you would help us to flip the autopilot off of our lives. Lord, it is so easy just to kind of get going down a path and just get into a rhythm of life and not really pay attention to the details or not pay attention to the direction that we're heading. And there's little choices that we make, little decisions that we make. We go out for a night for just a stroll. But it leads to something that leads to something else, that leads to something else. And suddenly we find ourselves in a place that we never wanted to be. Maybe you're watching the live stream right now, or you're here in the house and you would say, Darcy, I realize I'm on autopilot. There's an area in my life that I've just been kind of cruising along mindlessly. Maybe it's my marriage relationship. Maybe it's my finances. Maybe it's my walk with God. Maybe it's my parenting. Maybe it's my studies. Could even be your physical health. Flick off the autopilots. It's not your intention, it's your actions that lead to the destination that you desire, you prefer. Maybe you're here this morning and you say, you know what, I've already reached the destination I don't want to be at. Well, friends, I want to encourage you this morning that verse that we talked about earlier where it says the wages of sin is death, the rest of the verse says, but the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ. And maybe God doesn't cancel all the consequences, but friends, Jesus took on the eternal consequences. He took on the eternal consequences upon himself. And there is forgiveness, there is grace, there is mercy. And if you're at a place where you don't want to be this morning, I would encourage you just to pray this prayer. Jesus, I need your help this morning. Forgive me for not paying attention to my life. Forgive me for the wrong choices that I've made. Forgive me for being what Proverbs says, the fool. For not loving you with all my heart, mind, soul, and strength, and for choosing to go my own path. This morning, would you forgive me? Would you put me back on the right path that will take me to the right destination? And friends, if you are praying that prayer this morning, I want to encourage you that Jesus hears that prayer, and God is a God through his grace and his mercy can work miracles in our lives. And despite of where you're at, there is restoration, there is redemption, there is hope for you. Amen. Encourage you to check out Wisdom of Proverbs, the new version. Great devotional for these next few weeks. Can we stand together? If you're at home on the live stream, thanks so much for being with us. Let's sing this song as we close.
Let the King of my heart be the mountain where I run, found fountain I drink from. Oh, is my song. Let the King of my heart be the shadow where I hide, the ransom for my life. Oh, is my song. You are good, good. Oh, 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 let the King of my heart be the wind inside my sails, the anchor in the waves. Oh, is my song. Let the King of my heart be the fire inside my veins, the echo of my days. Oh, is my song. For you are good, you're good. Oh, you are good, you're good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh, you're good, God. You're never gonna let me down. 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 For you are good, good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh, you are good, you're good. Oh, you're good. Let's make this verse our prayer as we go this week. Let the King of my heart be the wind inside my sails, the anchor in the waves. Oh, is my song. Let the King of my heart be the fire inside my veins, the echo of my days. Oh, is my song. Yes.
Thank you so much for joining with Generations Church and our worship experience today. If you need prayer, our hosts would love to pray with you. You can just press the prayer button and they will just stay online for a little while longer. And may God bless you and your families this week in whatever season you find yourself in. Take care.